It's gonna be a party. It's a party. Everybody, thank you for. I don't even know what episode of What's Your Story at this point because I'm so blessed and overwhelmed by the opportunity I get to meet and connect with beautiful individuals truly showing up through the lens of love and making an impact. And today's guest is no different and yet so different because their story is so powerful and they always show up in unconditional love, which is a choice, guys. So, Jamie, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Carrie. Namaste, everyone. Honestly, it's such a joy to be here with all of you. My name is Jamie London Wollberg. I refer to myself as a leader of love, which is essentially someone who embodies their leadership and may even be in leadership roles and really is leading the charge to bring love into the world and to really just, make it a better place, which is cliche, but it's true.
All I could think of is heal the world, make it, and I can't sing it because then they'll be like, oh, you can't replay this, but whatever. Okay, I digress. So leader of love, which is so yummy to me, right? Because I fundamentally know that when we do things through the lens of love, we're in our power, right? But I can't imagine you were born and were like, "Oh, I'm gonna impact the world with love." So can you talk to me a little bit about how you have stepped into this understanding around yourself as somebody who is a leader and guided by love?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, while I believe that I chose to be born in this form for this purpose and mission, yes. At the same time, no, I did not. I was not
You
born
didn't wake up
crying.
and say, "Let's
Not
rally
crying, I'm
love."
a leader of yeah, that did not happen. Um, it is true that for those astrology lovers, I am an Aries. My moon is a Sagittarius. My Cancer is my rising is in Cancer, and so I am very much uh, dominant and yet also very empathetic and emotional. And basically, these worlds merge together within my spiritual gifts and my specific circumstances of having a really big health journey, as well as a really big spiritual journey that all linked in with my transition. I was assigned female at birth, and I have had an entire journey throughout my life to get to this perspective and to even the moment where I realized that my purpose was to anchor the remembrance of unconditional love
Mm,
into Gaia and to the collective. When I was very, very young, it was apparently very clear to the adults that were around me that I was incredibly loving and I was a nurturer. I didn't care about Barbies, but I was obsessed with Cabbage Patch dolls, which is a throwback. And if you're super young, you're probably like, "What are you talking about?" Because I don't even know if they exist anymore. But
they do.
essentially,
They
I
do.
do. They do.
Not
Okay.
not new ones, but you can buy old ones because I see them all the time. I'm like, "Yay!"
Oh my gosh, yeah. So in a nutshell, they're at the time they were the most sort of like realistic baby doll. Like the idea was that this was really about like pretending house, right? Like air quotes and stuff like that. And my mom at the time worked at a hospital and had a friend who worked in the NICU and would take me into the NICU with my 3 Cabbage Patch dolls in the stroller, that it came with, and I would literally get real diapers and real bottles and, like, the whole thing, and I was, like, parenting, and this is by, like, age 4. And so, they just knew, Jamie is going to do something to help people, and I kind of grew up with that narrative, but not really. I didn't feel like it was something forced to me. I don't recall ever sort of like being sat down and being like, "So, we've noticed you're really nurturing. You're going to help people. Let's find out how." That was not what was happening. I was very lucky that growing up in New York, which, depending on where you're at, can be, you know, liberal or not. I was born in the city,
Yep.
and I grew up mostly in the suburbs, and a very Jewish suburb called Scarsdale. And being queer Jewish kid in a town where people were very religious, and I was not raised religious, and people were very wealthy, and my family was on a different scale at the time, was isolating. But I ultimately felt isolated in general because I didn't feel like I fit in my body, and I was constantly dissociating, and I didn't really know why. When I
Mm,
was 4.5, I almost died of pneumonia, and
wow.
I was hospitalized for 10 days. And that shifted my immune system, but also my way of being. For those who are really deep into spirituality and curious, I believe that I had a walk-in experience, meaning that another aspect of my soul was like, "Tag, you're it. Like, I'm not dealing with this."
This anymore. Yeah.
And I believe that that walk-in was very masculine. And I
Yeah.
believe that that's a part of my transition. And why I tell this part of my journey is because this was a milestone moment. It's very clear in my journey that nothing was the same after that. So these key things I want you to take away were that I had a very structured environment while having parents that ultimately were liberal. So these very polarizing experiences. I was very nurturing as an 89 baby in a world that was dealing with a lot of anger and hatred at the time. And I was seemingly a very lucky and healthy kid who survived this really challenging health dynamic. And from there, my body just never really responded the same. And I just grew up kind of feeling half in, half out, which was
So
interesting.
explain
Okay.
that for somebody who maybe like, what do you mean by half in, half out?
So I was dissociating a lot. I just basically didn't feel like I was fully here. I
Okay.
would not have been able to explain this to you until many years later
Yeah.
in therapy when I learned what dissociation was.
Which I think most people dissociate from their lives all the time. That's it's addiction and it's separate but the same, but I get it.
Yeah, and I actually just super recently, sort of like ping ponging around because time is an illusion, anyways. I just discovered officially that I am autistic, and so now looking back through my life through this lens that I'm starting to do, I'm realizing that that was certainly an added component. But essentially, I felt extra dimensional, and I've come to believe that is, you know, an aspect of me that I believe is an aspect of all of us, is we are souls having a human experience. And I feel like, in a sense, when we are dissociating, it is for safety, and we are essentially going to some form of another home. Where it is, I couldn't tell you because I still to this day, I dissociate much rarer than I once did, but I couldn't tell you where I go. I
Yeah.
don't remember anything. I sometimes lost hours.
Yep.
So being half in and half out while trying to find out who you are, and also feeling rejected by society and being bullied throughout, my life, and having challenges in school in a very intense academic world. If you go and look into Scarsdale, you know that their public systems are world famous for being very academic, very sports related, and basically, if you were not the picture perfect of all of these things combined and aesthetically beautiful from a traditional viewpoint, you were rejected.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
felt that. I
Yeah.
felt rejected, and I didn't feel fully here. So it was hard to figure out who I was and embody
Yeah.
that.
So for me, I had a very similar experience in feeling rejected, right? Different path, but same fundamental experience. Did you ever make up stories around your worth? Because I know for me, like, that rejection caused me to believe fully that I was a piece of crap, like, I was unworthy and I didn't deserve. So I struggled a lot with depression and anxiety in my formative years because of the stories I made up based on that rejection. I'm curious how you experienced it within your own mind.
Oh, I'll give you a direct example. And I want to be clear that I've like really healed this narrative with my mom. So if she ever potentially listens to this interview, remember that I love you. But but still an important story. Um, when I when I was 4, my mom unintentionally left me in the grocery store. And so one of my earliest memories is crying and screaming and feeling lost, feeling confused, feeling abandoned, and feeling just unsure, I guess
Yeah.
is what I would say. But of course, a 4-year-old takes all of these things and everything feels that much more, magnified. And she realized it when she got to the traffic light. That I remember this so clearly, and she was talking to me and I wasn't responding. And she was like, "Oh no," and she went to get me. But of course, that felt like lifetimes.
Yeah. Yep.
So I say this because that's sort of how I took every moment of rejection. It felt like lifetimes of not being desired, of being picked last, or not being picked at all. And I absolutely went through a narrative where I was incredibly anxious and depressed. By the time I was 13, I was deeply suicidal on and off, um, and very angry, very, very angry about things that I didn't even understand that I was angry about,
Yeah.
because I didn't understand that you know, I didn't understand that I was autistic. I didn't understand that I was trans. I didn't understand any of these things until way later in my life, in my mid
Yeah, you
20s.
just
So,
felt like you didn't fit in and that you weren't seen, heard, or valued, right? Yeah,
yeah.
that's a hard place to be. And I have so many questions because does I'm gonna pause this question because it's around you identifying as autistic for later. But so you talk about being suicidal and you also talk about being deeply rooted in spirit now. So I'm curious, you had this bout of pneumonia that was life changing within your body at 4.5, and then you talk about this medical journey that really moved you towards this knowing, right? Like this healing. Is it because of the pneumonia or is it because you identified as masculine energy in a feminine body? Like what was that health journey that led you to this space that you're in now?
Hmm. I feel that they're directly correlated. I usually refer to it as my tri awakening because literally the spiritual, the transition, the medical awakening all converged into a very specific moment. So, why I always tell the pneumonia story is because that was a first initial catalyst. And now that I've had a lot of therapy around it, I've gone spiritually as well, deeply through it to understand it more. It's been a big part of that journey. But when I was 21, I had a very, very rough case of pneumonia. I mean, sorry, not pneumonia. Well, I did have pneumonia again, but shortly after that, which didn't hit me as hard. But shortly after that, I ended up with Lyme's disease,
Mm,
and that's because if you live in New York and you go through wooded areas, even if you're dressed properly, it can happen.
yeah.
And that sucker bit me right through my jeans. And I
Wow.
ended up with, yeah, I was fully dressed. I was a literal Girl Scout. Like I knew what to wear, and
Yeah.
I was properly dressed, but it did not care. And it ended up being chronic Lyme's disease, which was something at that time was not understood. The belief was you would have Lyme's disease and then you would get over it
Yep.
and then you would move on with your life. And while there was this sort of theoretical rebound, they didn't really look at it in this way of chronic. To compare it to and contextualize it to something that's very current, right? When we first discovered COVID, there wasn't this awareness of like long COVID,
Yep.
right? There was this
100%.
awareness of you could get COVID again, but who knows, right? And there were all these preventative measures that you could take. So, we often discover that these things have a bigger impact. So, and it did. A couple of years later, I had a huge emotional breakdown through a very big series of romantic endeavors and personal endeavors. And at this point, I had questioned my gender. I had already identified as queer when I was much younger, identified as bisexual. And so I'd already come up through this whole coming out journey, and I was being majorly suppressed and hyper feminized, which I was allowing by the person that I was in love with because I was a people pleaser and I was in love, and that was what I cared about. Was, again, that abandonment wound is so strong from that inner child, right? So I was like, love me, love me, love me. What can I do so that you can love me? Will
Yep.
you love me if I do this? And so I just buried it all back down. And the culmination of these things, when we have emotional and mental burnout, we manifest it physically. And I did. And so
Thank
it
you
just,
for sharing that. Hold up,
it,
listening audience. I really want you to hear this because it's something I touch upon so much. We cannot bury our experiences. It will manifest in ways that you can't even comprehend, whether it's in physical, whether it's mental or external, because we're magnets. We attract what it is that's internal. So like the world we experience is going to reflect what we are not releasing, what we are not honoring and healing. So thank you for sharing that and continue, please.
you're so welcome. So, I started to have all these co-infections, which for me turned out to be autoimmune diseases. And for those who aren't familiar, Lyme's disease is a disease that is tick-borne illness and is one of these things where you never know what the tick is carrying and it sort of just ripples out. So it's a very complicated, actually, interestingly, very intelligent
Yeah.
um, consciousness, basically, that can cause a lot of damage whenever it feels like. And it's so smart that once it causes damage somewhere and it's like, oh, we're bored, it just like goes somewhere else.
Yep.
So
Good.
um, it really manifests in all these different autoimmune diseases and fibromyalgia and all these different things. And I was bedridden. And I had this whole vision for my life and this life that I was building, the person I thought I was going to marry, the baby I thought I was adopting, the life that I thought I was going to live career wise. All of these things felt like they were gone in an instant. Well, it wasn't quite an instant. It was over time. I was getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And then I was bedridden. And the first time I was bedridden for almost 9.5, 10 months. And during that time, this is when I had the tri awakening. So imagine that you are 10 out of 10 pain, whatever that means for you. And I've discovered I have a very high pain tolerance,
Me
but
too,
it's
which is not great because we can get through. I worked on a broken ankle for like 6 months.
it's like anything else in life. It's got its benefits and its costs. And I was deeply suicidal. I could basically barely get myself to the bathroom. And I couldn't understand what the point of life was because again, remember, I knew that I was here to help people and I wanted to help people. And I did get through all of my anger, well, most of my anger at the time. I will say most of the anger that was happening when I was a teenager and all these things. I had figured out a lot of things about myself. I was proudly out as queer. I was living my life. I was
Yeah.
figuring my stuff out. Not everything was figured out, and I definitely don't want to go back to that time frame of who I was mentally and emotionally and how much I've learned. But it was a time where I could have gone forward with life, but not fully authentically. And the
Yeah.
joke was on me because I was convinced that I was living this authentic life. But when you are bedridden for such a long period of time and you are in your early 20s and all your friends are going and playing and being 20s and you have nothing else to do but think, I was in pain and thinking and evaluating absolutely everything, pretty much the things that you usually don't think someone does until they're basically about to transition off this plane.
Yep.
And I was blown away by the things that I was discovering, and I realized that if I was going to move forward, that I was going to have to live authentically and completely change. And basically, I realized that I was trans. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do about it. I realized I can't live like this forever. And if I'm going to help people, then I'm going to have to get better. And I prayed for basically my first time ever.
So this is where you lean it. So you prior to that, you didn't connect with something greater than yourself. Okay.
No, I think that there was a part of me earlier than that I do feel like there was a part of me that did believe somewhere inside that there was something greater, but I didn't grow up going to Hebrew school. Yes, I went to bar and bat mitzvahs, but I didn't have one. You know, it was very layered and complicated, and I was very blessed that my parents didn't force me into this, and at the same time, I didn't have any guidance. So
Yeah.
there's also that extreme of the coin, right? It sucks to be, um, forced into a dogma of some kind or
Yep.
even into a religious cult. A lot of people that I'm connected to happen to have that experience.
Yep.
It's also not super fun, evidently, to have really no guidance because
That was
my
me too.
parents were in different things. And so, I really don't believe in a better than or less than or right or wrong. It was just the experience was the experience.
I love that you said that because I am 100% like in alignment in that the journey that we are on, that we, I believe, endeavored to take prior to this experience isn't good, bad, right, or wrong. It is just a path in which we are on to get to home, I
Mhm.
believe, to love, to unconditional love. So I totally understand that. But I get it because I like you had no guidance and I had to discover it on my own through books. Thank God for my parents cuz they taught me to read. So
There you go. Yeah, it helps to get your information how you get your information,
yeah,
right?
it's true.
Um,
Can I ask you,
yeah.
so I'm thinking, so 89 baby, your early 20s, this is early 2000s that you're now discovering that you identify as male or masculine energy. That had to be scary because in the early 2000s, I mean, even now, right? The language is always is this ebb and flow of fear and then love and then fear and love. But that wasn't a time where it was as accepted to be trans.
No. I mean, I had a rough go to varying degrees, even coming out as bisexual. And
Yeah,
interestingly enough, I had a bigger uprising happen to me when I decided to identify as queer. Because
really?
because a lot of older generations were like, this is a slur in our community. How could you want to do this? And I was like, because we're reclaiming it and it's complicated, but we're reclaiming it. And basically for me, queer is this really beautiful umbrella term, and at the time was like the term within the LGBTQ AI2S plus community that was like, which at the time, for reference, was just like the LGBT,
Yeah,
community. At the time, we were just discovering really the queer, but it was just this looser terminology. And so, for someone who wanted to identify in lesser lines of boxes and didn't feel comfortable, that was a term that we were starting to utilize.
yeah,
And while I don't actually understand the specific moments of really how that happened, I understand how I found out and how that happened for me. And I've been somehow sort of running from identities for a really long time, but not in the sense of necessarily hiding, because as you can, by the time I was 2014 was when I was really starting to lean into my transness, but it was in 2011, 2012 when I actually had this moment of like, whoa, gender, you can change that. Like that's
yeah,
something that people question. And I started to connect all of these dots, which is something that we all do in another context when we're figuring out who we are, right?
of
And I want to be
course.
clear that just because I don't, I'm transmuting and releasing a lot of identities throughout my life. And while we are all shedding and transforming through, it doesn't mean that it's right or wrong to hold on to these identities. It's something that humans do to understand and to explain and to contextualize, and we learn a lot from that.
Yep.
I do find a lot of freedom now. I'm releasing them, more and more. But at the time, I was very fixated on releasing boxes to just enter into bigger boxes because that was what I needed.
Yeah.
Um, so
Well,
back,
I think
okay.
to your point though, we're meant for expansion. And I just had this conversation with somebody yesterday. this is why I never say never, because we really fundamentally don't know. I have no idea what my journey is going to open me up to a day from now, a year from now. And so I love that you recognize that yes, this is the experience that truly feels in alignment, feels yummy, feels supportive and nurturing for you. And yet somebody who may be in a different experience where they're like, oh, maybe I identify as male, but I'm in a female body, and this is where I am comfortable staying right now. That's cool too, because that's where you're at. And you may move into a different perspective, you may not. And ultimately for me, Jamie, and I think this is what I love about you, is what it's what feels yummy for you. It's what makes sense for you and doesn't I don't have to understand it, because the energy that you exude because you're honoring yourself is a gift you give to the world. And that's all I care about is unconditional love is a felt, it's a knowing energy that people attract to, and you can only get that by honoring yourself. So I love that you shared that with the listening community. Yeah.
I 1000% agree with you.
Yeah.
We are of unconditional love. We programmed ourselves to forget because we needed to in order to remember again for our expansion. So we're just remembering and forgetting and remembering and forgetting all the time because, also the human vessel is not designed to be omnipotent. You're not
Yeah.
meant to experience all of your lifetimes and all of your moments all at once, even though they're happening. I mean, I can tell you that I experience at times several. It feels like at once, like especially those. For example, if you're listening and you have a lot of double deja vu, or even just deja vu in general. The double deja vu is like I'm having deja vu and then having deja vu about this deja vu moment,
Yep.
right? And sometimes I get vertigo. Like I get literally dizzy and nauseous, and I'm like, whoa, can you imagine experiencing more of this all the time right now?
Yeah.
No, your body's preparing, right?
Yep.
The ascension journey, the experiences, the symptoms that we're having of dis-ease is coming because we're expanding, and our spiritual, mental, and emotional are like, woo, and our physical body's like, wait for me. And, it's trying to contain all of this energy. So yes. So back to praying. So I prayed. Of course, I had limited, movie and going to a synagogue or a church, for some sort of thing to support someone else in their endeavors, like awareness of what prayer was. I don't, you know, it was not complicated. It was me saying literally, I am suffering. I am here to help people. I don't understand why this is happening, how I can help people if I'm going to continue this. And frankly, if I'm going to continue this, then I would rather you just take me out of here, take me out of the game, bring me a new game. At that time, I did believe in karma, and my beliefs on reincarnation were minimal at
Yeah.
best at that time because I just did not understand what I
Yep.
understand now. Or more so, I didn't understand what I understand now. Um, And I said, if you heal me and I can get out of this bed, I will do whatever is necessary to live my authentic life. And I will spend the rest of my days helping people to do the same. And the example I love to use, it just always comes to me, is the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory one where, suddenly Charlie gets the golden ticket to go to the factory and he invites his grandfather, and his grandfather suddenly can just jump out of bed from bedridden and walk and is dancing around. It was not like that. It was not a movie moment where suddenly in that moment a beam of light came down and Jesus himself, the Christ light, came into my soul and I jumped out of bed and was ready to go. That is not what happened. However, something did. Something did happen. Something notable, something that to this day I can explain and do way more complicated things spiritually, and yet I still feel like I can't explain that moment.
Yeah.
Simply put, to some degree, God, source, universe, Allah, whatever resonates with you, the more heard me and responded.
Yeah.
And I felt it. And some tiny, 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 tiny seed of hope was planted in me. And that was enough for
Yep.
me to start to navigate these waters. And to what Carrie was saying earlier, right? Like when I started my transition, I was thoroughly convinced that I was purely masculine being, that I was a trans man, and I was totally gung ho on this. If you referred to me as anything other than he, him, I lost my shit.
Yep.
I am not proud of how I would respond, but I was reacting because I was hurt and I was insecure and I didn't understand. And there was really there were barely books on any of this at the time. And through my journey and deepening my spiritual waking in, right, which is where my company Wake In comes from. I woke up, now you wake in, right? So it's the coming internally. So I woke up to what was happening around, to the greater possibility of something more, something larger, being a part of one whole
Yep.
collective, to now, okay, let's go deep inside and figure out who I am and understand who that is, so that way I can express that authentically to the world and be in that unconditional love. But I still didn't understand unconditional love at that time. That came later. And
This does
so,
it all. Peeling that onion one
mhm,
layer at a time, baby.
one layer at a time. So I now realize that I am non-binary. I
Yep.
identify as a person of trans experience, trans masculine, non-binary, and for me, this is because I see the construct for what it is. It's a potent construct of gender that I believe personally, while I respect everyone's gender journey entirely, wherever you are is beautiful for you, I firmly believe that it's very damaging, and that it's actually a construct that is at the basis of a lot of other constructs. And so for me, what was best was to see the expansion of this, and instead of a construct, to see a spectrum. And everything in my life I've realized is a spectrum, and I've realized that
It
everything is a
is a
spectrum.
spectrum.
We're
Think
all light beings.
Yeah, and if you think about hermetics, everything has opposites and there's no concrete anything. There's no concrete heat, there's no concrete cold. There's varying degrees. So I love that you identify and recognize that. And fundamentally we are light beings. And so we all exist in a masculine and feminine energy, right? And so it's like for me, I don't have an attachment to my body to like focus on like needing to change it because it's just something I don't even consider. But I also recognize that in any given moment, I can be really, really tapped into a energy of masculinity, and then the next moment I can be hella feminine and unapologetic in either because it feels good for me in that moment.
Yep. That's beautifully put, because it's a balance, and the balance looks different for everyone, and it looks different all the time. And for me, these energies are all divine energies. Again, these are these other words that we utilize and created to explain and understand and communicate better.
Yep.
So in a way, these terms were created to help us remember our unconditional love, but we have a hard time as human beings sometimes, not going sort of too far and complicating things. We're super good at complicating things.
Overcomplicating it. But
Yeah.
that's the thing. We can't know, and that's why, think about some of the greatest, people, like, Alan Watts. I love, love, love his work. I really do, and yet he drank himself to death because I think that when you consume so much information, logic actually separates you from that knowing. Because when you're trying to understand what ultimately is unknowable until you have experienced enlightenment or you've had that that what is it revelation conversation, i.e. with source, that thing, could make you insane, and I've seen so
Mhm.
many people who have gone insane trying to understand something like that. So again, that's why I love that you recognize I'm going to embrace authenticity and what that is for you, right? What feels good for you in any given moment, because that to me is fundamentally co-creation with creation, because we're constantly showing up differently in each moment. But when you do that empowered in love, then it's a bright, you're brightening your light and shining it onto
Mhm.
others.
Yep. Well, and here's the thing, right? That happened to Alan and people like that because they felt rejected and misunderstood. And as human beings, we have an inherent sense and desire to belong because we
Yep.
feel far from home.
Yep.
So it's, you know, it's a lot of that. I mean, I was the, I was I've ultimately been creating and still creating because I created this body. Like and I changed this body, and I want to be extremely clear that I have zero regrets for everything I've done in my medical transition. It was absolutely what I needed to do to save my life.
Yep.
And everyone has a different way of going about it. But I'm, very grateful that I trusted somehow this deep knowing, right? My clairs were activated without even knowing what clairs were, right? Like I had this deep knowing and trust in my intuition. And I was frankly pouring love into myself unconditionally by saying, like, okay, I need to change this. And so it wasn't until my mid 20s when I finally started to come out to other people and I started to undergo my medical transition. Hugh, now I've been transitioning basically for 11 years. Medically, I think for 10, I think was my last anniversary. I don't count these things anymore because I just don't they don't matter to me anymore because that wasn't the point for me.
Yeah.
The point for
Yep.
me was not to be stealth, and it was also not for me to obsess over these things. It was
Yep.
to feel in alignment and feel my inner truth expressed outwardly so that way I could feel seen and loved by myself and by others. And, the joke was that I thought it was to be seen by others purely, and it wasn't. It was really more so to
How
be seen.
can you really receive love if you don't love yourself? That's why, when I'm working with people, how you talk to yourself is so much more critical than how you talk to anybody else. Because if you're waiting for somebody else to love you, like so that you feel loved, you're gonna be waiting lifetimes, because you've got like you have to do the inner work. I feel so aligned. But I do want to touch upon the autism piece, because to me, when we're thinking about transgender and we're tying all this in, right? And you're understanding that we're constantly fluid and stuff. I personally believe labels can be beneficial if they free you from this idea that there's something wrong with you, or that whatever, right? Because it gives you permission to do things in a way that helps you get the thing done that you need to get done, whatever that is. But I also see that labels limit, right? There's this. So I was interviewing somebody yesterday who's like, I'm neurospicy. So I rock when this is an executive director of a nonprofit. I rock, I sing. When my mind's wandering, I come back to like a show tune. And the way they identify is neurospicy. Um, how do you utilize that label of autism to free you rather than limit you? And how do you teach other people to do the same?
It's a great question. I would say that it comes down to self validation and self confirmation. So when I was a child, um, very young, it became very clear that something was going on, but they had no idea what it was. And it already started by age 2.
Yep.
Um, and by the time I was in middle school, I already had been starting to get some forms of testing, not for autism, but in general for an IEP. And eventually, in high school, I had an IEP, and which we don't really have time to go into that school lingo. But essentially, what it comes down to is I was in a mixture of specific classes for those who have um, uh, differentiated intellectual abilities and behavioral experiences,
Yeah.
um, or expressions. And so, with that, I also had very specific um, elements of support in order for me to basically, have an equal playing field, or as equal playing field as possible. And it was very clear that I was intelligent. The things that I was intelligent in and my gifts were like super high percentile, and then I was in like the 10th percentile and the 5th percentile and other things. Um, and it stemmed because by the time I was in elementary school, I was meant to be able to read. I couldn't, and I somehow was masking and skating by this on my other intellectual abilities, until one day my mom was like told by the teacher, and like like they all realized, and they were like, "Wait, what? Jamie can't read, couldn't tell time on a clock,
Wow.
all of these things." And they started to wonder what was going on. So I had the IEP. We didn't do the autism testing, which I very recently, in very recent years, found out it's extremely expensive if
Yeah.
not covered. Which at the time I doubt any insurance was covering this, and if the school wasn't going to pay for it, then it was
Yeah.
going to be very expensive. I don't exactly understand totally to what degree, but I know that right now, like it's like thousands and thousands of dollars to test an adult for autism unless you go through some sort of organization.
Yeah.
So fast forward, I was told that I had executive functioning disorder, which now is basically laughable because executive functioning challenges are the core of autism, and autism is a spectrum, and neurodivergence is a spectrum.
Yeah.
And so I started to identify as neurodivergent, and that felt freeing in the sense that there was now language around an experience, which led me to be able to build into community and to have conversations about my way of thinking and my needs.
Yeah.
And it still was not understood for a really long time. And then in the very last, recent couple of years, I just, magnets, right? Mirrors, I started to attract what felt like an unreal number of people into my life who were neurodivergent and identified with neurodivergence, neurospicy autism, any number of these things. To the point where I was like, whoa, do I know any neurotypical people anymore? And so I started to hear about their stories, and I started to experience them, and I started to see these kinds of things reflected in myself. And I was like, holy crap. And what it really took was one day, I'm also polyamorous, and I was listening to um, podcasts on ethical non monogamy. And it just so happened that one of the hosts and one of the people that were being interviewed identified with neurodivergence and autism. And this person who was being interviewed expressed that while they firmly believe in self-diagnosing, that they and going on that journey, and that's valid, that they realized that it was actually super linked into them understanding and being able to get what they needed in life in terms of resources, but also within their polyamory journey.
Yeah.
And they highly recommended getting tested. And I'm obviously shrinking the story down and simplifying it, but it was totally mind blowing. And it was literally in that moment where I was like, that's why I want to get tested. I
Gotcha.
want to get tested because I want the resources that I'm missing. That I realized that I was effectively jealous of my friends who were getting the support that I felt that I needed. And also at this point, I had gone through a legal disabled journey, and they ripped my disability and my medical all in one because of a $7 overpayment. When I got back to New York after living in Los Angeles for 6 years, and I was frankly fucked in a lot of different ways. And this became a whole legal battle and journey. And I realized that it was like every every bird was touched upon by me doing this. There was no loss. And I ended up with a um, private social worker, very grateful for this experience, who I still currently have, who helped me realize that while it would be challenging, there was a way,
Yeah.
and there was a way to do it without getting having to pay huge fees. And through that and my lawyer and everything, I started to realize like I could basically reclaim my life and be able to clear up a lot of different things and to be able to access a lot of things that I firmly believe that I deserve and that I need. It's impacting my day to day. And I know that with my mission and purpose, I want to be able to be at my highest and best self so that I can serve most powerfully and experience the joy that we all
Yeah.
deserve and the belongingness I deserve. So I did. And I just literally got my diagnosis the other day. It was a many month journey, and I still have more to go to get the rest of my services and everything. This is not an easy peasy thing. And my IEP saved my ass because I am turning 36 at the end of this month, of March, whenever you're listening to this, 2025. And so you age out of a lot of these things by the time you're 22.
Yeah.
So I was just diagnosed with, and the terminology they used was severe autism, which is obviously not words that feel yummy or good, but like I am so relieved that I'm leaving that caring for later, like when I have the capacity and the power to put my hand at supporting in these language changing. But again, release of labels. What I cared about was I got the confirmation
Yep.
that my family and me knew for a long time. It has completely started to change how people treat me in a way that I deserve and desire. People that were bullying me or trying to treat me in a different way that was they weren't meeting me where I was. I'm about to have access to support in the things that I need to be stronger in, and that are just I've tried everything else, and it's not going to get better without the support that I need. So it's hugely freeing. To give you an idea, I happened to be on the phone with my mom at the time when the letter came, and I opened it, and I literally almost fell to my knees. I caught myself and I grabbed my knees and I literally was like breathing and tears were coming to my eyes. I was just overwhelmed with relief. Even saying that right now, my whole body is tingling. I just felt more whole. And I felt like this light at the end of the tunnel where I am positive that by the end of 2025, I will be living on an entire other timeline of existence because of the support that I'm finally going to have. So while I'm sure that eventually I will also release a lot of attachment to the identity of autism, right now it is super important because I'm understanding and overstanding my life in a way that is monumental, and it's healing my relationships and it's creating a possibility for me to get support. And that is freedom, right? That is freedom when we have access to resources, when
Yep.
we have what we need to function, which we
Mhm.
all deserve. And it allows me to unconditionally love myself that much deeper
Yeah.
because I've peeled things so far back and I'm learning about myself even more than ever before. So it's just discovering more and more to love unconditionally. So that's why. That's why for me it was the right journey. Did I
And
answer
this is
that
beautiful. I think
question?
it's beautiful because I think, well, for me, my understanding is just to your point. What matters at the end of the day for anybody who's listening, and I know that Jamie and I are in total alignment on this one, so I can speak for both of us, is that it doesn't ever have to make sense for anybody else. But it does have to make sense for you and it has to feel right for you. Like, there's no right or wrong, good or bad, but it has to make you feel okay with your experience. Because I fundamentally believe we are meant to experience joy and freedom in this lifetime, whatever that looks like for you. And, polyamorous, non-binary, autistic, if that makes you like, if that gives you the capacity to experience joy and freedom. Well, in that energy, you're giving other people permission to do the same. And that ultimately is the gift you give to the world in your unconditional love for self. So it does, and it's beautiful. With only a couple minutes left, God, I could have you on here again.
I'd love
Yeah.
to.
Well, then let's do that. Why don't you leave our listening audience with a nugget and we'll pause it and then do a second round so that you can kind of go deeper into how you show up in love for others and how your spiritual journey has given you access to be able to meet the needs of others so that they can expand their awareness and um experience freedom and joy the way you have been able to cultivate in your experience here.
Oh yeah. Oh, I know totally where to leave off. So essentially, what it boils down to is I can serve powerfully and help others because I have helped myself. I serve myself powerfully. When in the early days of the pandemic in 2020, November 2020, I found myself very luckily relocate. At the time, I was living in LA, and I was able to go with my cats and my buddy to go and visit my parents' place that they have in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a hotspot of spirituality and activity of all kinds. And I started to have deeper awareness of a lot of these abilities that I was having. I was having a lot of these extra dimensional, deeper paranormal experiences. I started to channel. By the time it was December 2020, I was an early adopter on Clubhouse, and I discovered a massive spiritual community where I was eyes open to all of these different perspectives, and I just ate it up. I literally spent like 18 hours a day on the app, no joke, for at least the first couple of weeks. And I was enmeshing myself in all these different things. And I started to train and study in a lot of different modalities, and just allow myself to express all of this power. And so I realized, in a powerful journey with the fungi spirit, I received the message that unconditional love of self was the key to unconditional love for humanity. I had literally asked the question. I remember distinctly pacing and crying in my room. It was, early pandemic. And I was terrified, like so many of us, about what was going on in the world. And I was like, how do I help? What do I do? What is going on? What is the answer? And so once I realized that it was unconditional self love, that's what I did. I continued the journey of self love. I have a beautiful, rising and evening routine, which is a spiritual wellness routine. And by practicing this and pouring into myself, I'm able to pour into everyone else. And I've really just become a coach, mentor, and healer through my own experiences and expanding and sharing with those who are attracted to me. And my journey was a journey of burnout. So that's where I'll leave you. And we'll talk about the burnout next time.
I love that so much. And so, for the listening audience, just to make sure it's very clear, um, your power lies within. And however you were guided, called to, or brought to your knees to find this truth, the truth is until you learn to love yourself unconditionally, you will experience deep and immense suffering in your journey. And so Jamie and I both implore you to find whatever resources, means necessary. Give yourself permission to learn to love yourself and to heal those wounds so you understand that you are worthy of that unconditional love. And when you do, uh, there's a freedom that is so beyond our ability to convey on the other side of that journey. So until next time with Jamie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
All a joy and laughter filled day. And remember, laughter is the best medicine. So find moments of laughter in each moment in each day. Mwah.
Wow, I love you all.